So one thing that is crucially important when you're working in Maya is to stay organized. Now this is probably the most boring part of any training in Maya, but perhaps the most important. Um, it's important to stay organized within your files and in your entire project setup. Now we're going to look at more complex project setup later on when we're dealing with textures, when we're dealing with where we send our renders, when we're dealing with importing models into animation scenes and so on. But for now, let's just look at the very basics of setting up a project and being organized within your file. So the first thing is, when you're working on a file, name your objects. Simple as that. Give them a sensible name so when you return to a project after a little while or to a file, things make sense. Even like this, I've got 3 area lights in here. It would make more sense for me to name them, key light, fill light, and backlight. Maya doesn't accept spaces in any of its names, so you can use this sort of camel structure where you have uppercase letters in the middle to separate words, or you can work with underscores to separate words. That's pretty common practice. You'll also notice I've got these dividers between types of things. Now this isn't essential, but it's something that I do a lot of the time. I'll just make these dividers to put different types of objects cleanly between things. So this is a null object, and to make a null object you just have nothing selected and you go to edit and group and it will create a null, and it's just an empty transform node. And so I could call this, what could I call this? What else would I put in here? Having a little, I could call this, particles, and I could just use this as a divider in the outliner to have particles separated in the scene. Now, pro tip with the outliner, you'd see this little dotted line at the bottom. You can drag this up. You can have 2 views of the same outliner for moving things around. When you move things in the outliner, you have to use the middle mouse button to drag them. If there's a square around another object, it will group them together or make one the child of the other. If it goes to a line, it will just move it in between those objects. So naming things, organizing things. But what's more important is to actually set projects in Maya. So what we're in right now is what's called a Maya scene file. And so a Maya scene file can be just for modeling, it can be for animating, whatever. But often in a project for a whole animation, you're going to have a series of scene files, some with models, some with animation, some with lighting, so on. And so you need to have a bigger container for all of these things, and in Maya that's called a project. So to set a project in Maya, the most basic way to do it is go to File, Project Window, and this allows you to create a new project. I'm going to put mine on my desktop in my video training folder, and then I'm going to name this project Organization Video. So of course you would name it whatever would be appropriate, and then in these fields down here, this will create a folder within this project folder with this name. Whatever name is typed in here, that will be the name of the folder. And there's plenty of stuff by default. Now you don't need all of these things a lot of the time for the projects that you're setting up. And so you could leave it the defaults, but then you would get a project that has lots of empty folders, and you kind of want to keep things as clean as possible. Now we will talk about a more advanced setup later on, but one thing you can do is just go to Edit, Clear Settings, and you can type in the names for a few folders. So Scenes is where Maya wants to save your Maya files. So this thing we're working in right now is a Maya file. And it's saying, well, where do you want me to save these things? And so it's going to go into the Scenes folder, but I usually like to call the Scenes folder Maya. Images is another important one. This is where Maya will save renders. So if you render out a sequence of images, it will look in the project file to know where to save those renders, and it's going to go into whatever folder you name here, and I usually call this renders. source images. So if you've got a texture that you've painted in Photoshop or something, or an HDR image that's going to form the background of your scene, Maya is going to look for those textures in its source images folder, whatever you've called it. And I usually call this text. Now there are scripts, sounds, clips, render data, and I don't really need all these things most of the time. If for some reason I start putting particles in the scene, then there will be a folder, probably disk cache, that will contain particle information, and Maya will generate that for us anyway after the fact. So we can just do this and accept this, and then we'll do a save as, Control Shift S or Command Shift S, and it will take us to that Maya folder where we expect things to go. And then we can save as different file types. Well, when you're saving a Maya file, you only have two choices, a Maya ASCII file or a Maya binary file. And I would say by default you should change it to Maya ASCII, which will give you an MA file name. If it's Maya binary, it would be MB. If you forget and save it as a Maya binary, not the end of the world. The benefit of the Maya ASCII file is that if you open this file in the text editor, you can actually read more of the included text and sometimes change things to fix a file or to just change certain qualities of it. It's a slightly bigger file if you save as MA, but not so big that it's going to make any realistic difference. So I'll just save as. And now if we go into our video training folder, which is on my desktop, so here's the project now. So project, organization, video. If I double click on it, now you see those three folders that I named, and the Maya file that I just created is in here. We have no renders yet, so there's nothing in there. We have no textures yet, so there's nothing in there. We have this one other file, and this is called a workspace file, and you also might see the ending, which is .mel. MEL stands for Maya Embedded Language. And this can actually be opened in a text editor. So if we open with Notepad, you can see that this is just setting certain things. So it's the Maya 2017 project definition, and it's telling Maya where to find things. Now, usually this will have page or line breaks, but I'm not seeing it here. But anyway, what this is doing is saying, well, where are we going to find certain types of assets that we need? So let me just find one that makes sense. Almost there. It's hard to read this. Okay. So remember when I said it's we wanted to create a folder for all the source images like textures and HDR, and we want to name it text. So when you start a project in Maya, you set the project first, and it will read this workspace file and say, okay, whenever I need a source image, look for a local folder called text. And that's all it's doing. So that means if I wanted to open this file, so I'm just going to create a new file. So let's say I wanted to go back to that. The best practice is not just to go File, Open Scene, or just to double click the file in your Windows Explorer or your Mac Finder. It's better instead to go to Set Project and then to navigate to that project. So this is the project folder. It's the one that houses all of these other folders, and the best way to identify is that your project folder is the one that contains the workspace.mel file. So we want to go back up one stage. When I select my project, I'm selecting this one. So I set, nothing happens, but now we've told Maya what project we're working in. So now when I go to File, Open, it goes to the correct folder to find my Maya file. And I open that, and we go right back to the beginning. So do you have to work that way? No, you don't, and things will still work to a certain extent. But then when you start to link things like textures, like referenced models from other files, you really need to have that project organization set up. So it's important to start following that practice early, because the project setup actually gets quite a bit more complicated as your projects grow, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on.